Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The stark reality of yesterday's budget is clear. Taxes rising, living standards falling, growth stalling. And yet again, making promises they can't deliver. The Tories have failed on the economy, they are out of ideas and they are out of time. Let me turn first to the most and potentially only remarkable bit of the budget statement yesterday. After an hour and 10 minutes, the Chancellor seemed to float an idea of getting rid of national insurance altogether. I wasn't quite sure what I'd heard, but then government ministers started touring the TV and radio stations, saying that this was indeed their intention. In what seemed to be a casual afterthought, the Chancellor has made a £46 billion unfunded commitment, leaving a gaping hole in the public finances, even bigger than the unfunded tax cuts announced in the Tory kamikaze mini-budget just 18 months ago. So let me ask the Secretary of State this. How does the Chancellor plan to pay for the £46 billion tax pledge made yesterday? To be more precise, what is the Chancellor's assessment of the impact that £46 billion of tax cuts would have on borrowing, tax rises elsewhere, or on public spending? Or has he simply managed to find the same magic money tree that his predecessor was so fond of? Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an omni-shambles budget from a desperate Tory party. Instead of recklessness, Labour will take a different approach. As Chancellor, I will never make a commitment without saying where the money will come from. That is the responsible approach. Madam Deputy Speaker, let's turn now to the other tax cuts that the Chancellor announced yesterday. 2 years ago, when the current Prime Minister wanted to increase national insurance, we opposed it. Since then, I have consistently said that I want taxes on working people to be lower. And so, just as we supported the last cut to national insurance, we support the measures announced in the Chamber yesterday to bring it down by a further 2p. But let's be clear, these measures come in the context of a rising tax burden, the highest it has been in 70 years, and the tax burden is rising in each and every year of the forecast period. Under this government's plans, for every £10 that they are taking from families in higher tax, they are only giving £5 back. They are giving with one hand and taking twice as much with the other. And they expect people to be grateful. Now, as the Resolution Foundation have highlighted just this morning, I'll happily give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to her for giving way. On that point, does she agree that the Prime Minister's tax plans will leave households on average £870 worse off under the Conservatives?
My honourable friend has done the maths, and she is absolutely right that by the end of the forecast period, the average family, when you take into account the changes to the tax thresholds, as well as the announcements yesterday and in November, and council tax as well, by the end of the forecast period, the average family will be £870 worse off. And as the Resolution Foundation have highlighted just this morning, if you are one of the 8 million tax-paying pensioners, you will see your taxes increase by an average of £1,000. That is a collective £8 billion tax grab from our nation's pensioners. And as Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, said yesterday, this remains a parliament of record tax rises. That is the legacy of this Conservative government. The Tory government's pickpocketing has meant higher taxes on working people, leaving them with less money at a time when their daily lives are getting more expensive. Yesterday, the Chancellor said that a person on average earnings is £900 better off. But let's take a look at that claim. What the Chancellor has ignored is not only his own stealth tax rises, with the tax thresholds and council tax, but also the rising cost of energy bills, food, mortgages and rent. In fact, rather than being better off, as the Chancellor claimed, household disposable income is set to fall by £200 per person over the course of this Parliament. I'll happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Shadow Chancellor for giving me. I completely agree that it is a stealth tax to deliberately leave tax thresholds untouched at a time when pay and prices are increasing. It's a stealth tax when this Chancellor does it. There's also a stealth tax when Gordon Brown did it.
Well, it's interesting to have an intervention from the SNP, who are increasing taxes on ordinary working people. I would probably just stay on the benches. This is the only Parliament on record where living standards are set to be lower at the end of the Parliament than they were at the beginning. The Chancellor chose to ignore all of those realities, but the truth is, ordinary families cannot ignore them. As people up and down the country know, the definition of being better off is having more money. And under the Tories, people have less. People feel worse off because they are worse off. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's look at economic growth. Growth is critical to our success as a nation, to our living standards and for providing sustainable funding for public services. But the Tories have failed here too. The context of yesterday's budget is a Prime Minister who pledged growth but has delivered recession. This economy is now smaller than when the Prime Minister took up office. Now, instead of bouncing back, we see that the UK's GDP is bumping along the bottom this year. The Chancellor, in his statement, rightly elevated the true measure of success. Not just higher GDP, but higher GDP per head. I agree with the Chancellor. This is the most important yardstick. So how are the Tories doing against this measure? The reality is that GDP per capita is set to shrink, not grow, this year, after having shrunk, not grown, last year too. GDP per capita is now expected to be lower at the end of this year than it was at the start of this Parliament. And yesterday we learnt that forecast GDP per capita growth has been revised down for 4 of the next 5 years. Hardly the success that the Chancellor was looking for. Now, the Chancellor said that it was important not to follow a path which relied on net migration to provide growth in GDP. I agree. Has the Secretary of State seen the chart on page 29 of the OBR's Economic and Fiscal Outlook, which shows net migration has been revised up by 350,000 over the next 5 years, the exact opposite of what the Chancellor spoke about. Our country has gone through a difficult time these past few years. The origins of many of the crises we have faced are global: pandemic, war, energy crisis. Other countries have experienced these shocks too. But each time crisis has hit, Britain has found itself acutely exposed because of the choices of successive Conservative governments. Austerity that choked off investment. Then Brexit without a plan. And then the Tories crashed the economy with their kamikaze budget. This Tory record of economic failure has held back our country for far too long. If the UK had grown at the average of the OECD rate since 2010, when the Conservatives came to office, it would now be £140 billion bigger than it actually is today. That is equivalent to £5,000 per household every year. And it would mean an additional £50 billion in tax revenues to invest in our public services. Growth matters, but the Tories are incapable of delivering it. The honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position we're doing better than the G7. There are only 2 G7 countries in recession today, us and Japan. That is their record, and they should be ashamed of it. This is the 12th Tory plan for growth in 14 years, and we still are in recession. From 5 Prime Ministers and 7 Chancellors, with none of them ever succeeding. We are trapped in a Tory doom loop of low growth and high taxes, and it is working people who are paying the price. I'll happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm just struggling a bit with the right honourable lady's figures. My own calculations suggest that pensioners this year will see an increase of £900 from an 8.2% increase in the state pension as a result of the triple lock. In all, since 2010, pensioners will be getting, I think it's £3,700 more than they were. That is a huge increase in their income, alongside all the cost of living help and winter fuel. And yet she was saying earlier that pensioners are going to be worse off. I don't follow the maths on this. Can she help?
Well, these are numbers about pensioners who pay tax from the Resolution Foundation that was published this morning. So the honourable gentleman can also look at those statistics. But it is the fact that because the tax thresholds have been frozen, pensioners who pay tax are paying more tax than they were before. That is the legacy of this government. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this isn't just about lines on a graph. It's about our high streets. It's about whether businesses grow. It's about whether we can create secure, well-paid jobs in all parts of the country with more money in the pockets of working people. Because if an economy does not work for working people, then it does not work at all. Madam Deputy Speaker, when the Tories are not pickpocketing the pockets of the taxpayer, they are pickpocketing Labour policies. Having spent years defending the indefensible, the Tories have belatedly listened to Labour and recognised the importance of closing the non-dom tax loophole. I believe if people make Britain their home, they should pay their taxes here too. The Office of Budget Responsibility says that the steady state amount of revenue raised by the non-dom policy is £3 billion per year. I first called for this loophole to be closed when it entered the public consciousness that some people weren't paying their fair share of taxes 2 years ago, meaning that we have missed out on £6 billion on tax revenue, money that could have been invested in our public services. And if any further proof was needed that Labour was winning the battle of ideas, it is our time-limited windfall tax on the oil and gas producers. Having originally opposed the creation of such a tax, the Tories were dragged kicking and screaming by Labour to create an energy profits levy. Even after yesterday's announcement of a one-year extension, the Tories are still leaving such gaping loopholes, which mean many energy giants will still pay less in tax. Meanwhile, the SNP oppose our proper windfall tax, while just 3 weeks ago putting up taxes on working people in Scotland for teachers, nurses and plumbers too. I'll happily take another intervention if he wants to defend it. Higher taxes for working people. Oh, bring it on.
Does the Shadow Chancellor not understand that the SNP's position is that there should not be a single windfall tax that only punishes the north east of Scotland? It should also be applied to every sector that has profiteered from war, from COVID and from rising increases. And does she not understand that the SNP's income tax policy means that low-paid workers, the people the Labour Party are supposed to protect, pay less income tax in Scotland than they would do in England, as well as nurses and care workers getting paid more in Scotland than they do in England? That's true, isn't it?
Well, all I would say to the honourable gentleman is put that on your leaflet. The fact is that nurses, teachers and plumbers are paying more tax in Scotland, and at the same time, the energy giants who are making huge profits, the windfalls of war, will pay less tax under the SNP. That is their record, and they should be ashamed of it. Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour is committed to investing more in our schools and in our hospitals. That was a priority before the budget, and it remains a priority now, because public services are on their knees after 14 years of Conservative failure. Labour believes in aspiration for all of our children, and we will not stand by while the roof is falling in on state education under the Tories. History is repeating itself, with children again taught in porter cabins as they were when I was at school under a Tory government. When the Tories undervalue our young people, they are squandering their potential and undermining our whole country's future. That is why the next Labour government will close the tax loopholes enjoyed by private schools. The money raised from ending their exemption from business rates and VAT will instead go where it is needed, to help the 93% of children in our state schools instead. I will always be clear that all of our policies in our manifesto will be fully costed and fully funded. Now the Tories have U-turned on their policy on non-doms, which we welcome. We will do the necessary work to show how our plans will be paid for. We will set that out in an orderly and a responsible way. Our public services are in a mess under the Conservatives. But a Labour government will begin to turn them round with an immediate injection of cash into our schools and our hospitals, by tackling Tory waste and with a serious plan to grow our economy to provide the sustainable finance that our public services need. Madam Deputy Speaker, it takes some nerve for the Chancellor to wag his finger at local councils this week, when the Tories and the Prime Minister have squandered billions of pounds of taxpayers' hard-earned money. Who has used excessive numbers of management consultants in central government? The Tories. Who signed the cheques and lost an additional £10 billion through dodgy PPE contracts? The Tories. Who left the vaults open so that organised criminal gangs could help themselves to £7 billion of public money through COVID fraud? The Tories. Who made a costly mess of HS2? The Tories. And who handed £500 million to the Rwanda government with nothing to show for it? The Tories. Meanwhile, maybe she has another example. I'd be happy.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's absolutely right, because every dimension of Conservative spending is showing wasteful and profligate spending. Does she agree with me that the £15,000 of taxpayers' money spent to settle the Secretary of State for Science's attack on a British scientist, an entirely unfounded and defamatory attack, that money would have been so much better spent supporting British scientists to drive British economic growth?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I think that taxpayers will find it pretty grating when they see their own tax bill going up, and yet this money is spent so callously and so casually. Meanwhile, the Chancellor has failed to do the right thing yesterday by setting out in the budget compensation for those affected by the infected blood scandal or wrongly accused sub-postmasters. That is an abdication of responsibility and a betrayal of all of those who have fought for justice for so many years, and it will not be forgiven. Now, I am under no illusion about the scale of the challenge that we may inherit, nor the scale of the task to rebuild our economy and our country. Labour's economic plan will take Britain from instability and short-termism to a mission-based government, prioritising economic growth and security for families and our country. It is built on the pillars of stability, investment and reform. Stability brought about by iron discipline, guided by strong fiscal rules and robust economic institutions. Investment, working with the private sector so we can lead the industries of the future, with a modern industrial strategy and a new national wealth fund to invest alongside business in our automotive sector, in renewable-ready ports and in the future of our steel industry. And reform, starting with our planning system, taking on vested interests to get Britain building again, supporting working people to develop the skills they need to thrive in the changing world of work, to make work pay with a genuine living wage and a new deal for working people. Our economy needs change. Britain needs change. And the verdict on the budget is in. There is no long-term plan for growth, and leading business organisations agree. The Institute of Directors said that the budget fell short of delivering a comprehensive plan for sustainable growth. The British Retail Consortium said the Chancellor has done little to promote growth and investment. The Trades Union Congress have highlighted that real pay is still below where it was in 2008. Whichever way you look at it, the Tories have failed on the economy. The damage is done. Nothing this week will compensate for the fact that people are worse off under the Tories. Taking £10 and handing back £5 is a swindle, not a giveaway.
People know it.
Working people paying more, pensioners paying more, homeowners continuing to pay more, reckless and desperate promises being repeated. The lesson from the budget is simple. You cannot trust the Conservatives with the economy. And the questions that people ask ahead of the next election are simple. Are me and my family better off after 14 years of Conservative government? Do our schools, our hospitals, our police and our transport work better when the Conservatives came to office 14 years ago? Frankly, does anything in our country work better when the Conservatives came to power? And the answer to those questions is a resounding no. If the Tories had any confidence in their plans and their record, they would name the date of a general election. It is time for the British people to give their verdict on 14 years of Tory failure. Only Labour can provide the change that our country so desperately needs.